are high sun exposure.
Out there in Zoom land, thanks for joining us for this virtual Avid Reader event. I echo your thoughts, Chrissy. It would be lovely to be in the store itself, having this chat with Katharine Murphy, but here we are on Zoom with everybody else. Katharine's new quarterly essay about politics in a time of COVID is called The End of Certainty, and ain't that the truth? As things stand right now, it's hard to feel certain about much. When will free interstate movement resume? When will I be able to visit my kids in Sydney and Melbourne? What about overseas travel? How deep and long will the economic recession be? What about the unemployment queues? Will we ever return to work as we did before? What has COVID changed forever about the way we live? The list of uncertainties goes on and on. Katharine is interested in what the pandemic means for how we are governed. What does the handling of this crisis tell us about the Prime Minister and his government? Has pragmatism ultimately triumphed over ideology or political philosophy? Are we still listening to the experts? How has the coronavirus changed politics in Australia? Perhaps Katharine has some answers to these questions. She's one of our finest political journalists. She's the political editor of The Guardian. Katharine, welcome to our Zoom conversation.
Thank you, Paul. It's really delightful to be here with you all.
A lot of this essay is about Scott Morrison, and you write that as a journalist, you wanted to document what it was like to be Prime Minister at this extraordinary moment in time and analyse how he is shaping or trying to shape these times. You're someone who, as a day-to-day political journalist, has spent a lot of time looking at Scott Morrison. What did you discover about him that perhaps you didn't know before? And has this crisis reinforced a view that you had about Scott Morrison, or has it changed it?
Oh, I think in some respects reinforced some views that I'd built up over time, Paul, about this parliamentarian, this politician, this man, this Prime Minister. And some discoveries, I think, particularly in the opening months of the crisis. I think I'm sure you'll acknowledge that we're in. I sort of tell my friends, well, we had a good 5 months of new politics, and we've kind of we're coming off that, but I'm sure we'll get into that in our conversation this evening. Okay, so what I went into this project with some views about the Prime Minister, the principal one being what a difficult subject he is. He is really very, very difficult to capture, and deliberately so. I don't say in the piece, but I've said a couple of times since, he's like a colouring book that you had as a kid. There's all these sort of beautiful outlines that you colour in feverishly when you're a child. Scott Morrison is the ultimate black outline onto which various things can be coloured and projected. And part, as you acknowledged, I think a second ago, part of documenting COVID was an attempt by me to try and capture this fellow in flight. It was sort of like a live action replay. He'd sort of be leaping off. I could press pause, I could turn him around, and I could look at him from different angles. So it reinforced that pre-existing notion I had of him as this outline, deliberately so, into which people can project their own needs and observations. But I think the pragmatism that the Prime Minister demonstrated in the opening months of the crisis, I think I wouldn't have expected that necessarily. That was a bit of a discovery, and I wanted, in my interview with him for the piece, I wanted to really invite him to unpack that with me in terms of how and why that happened, how that informs his resting political philosophy. So yeah, it was a bit of both, basically.
Yeah.
Some pre-existing thoughts, some discoveries.
Yes, much has been said about how the one good thing to come out of the pandemic early on was that politicians put down their weapons. They started listening to the experts, and they tried to respond as best they could to a challenge with a minimum really of ideology getting in the way. You brought this up with Scott Morrison, tried to get him to talk a little bit about this spirit of bipartisanship, if I can put it that way, because he's known as this quintessential creature of politics. How did he respond when you kind of put that to him?
Well, I think he was quite honest in the interview that I did with him. Honest in the sense of, I think the reflections that he made about decisions that he made at the peak of the first wave of the pandemic were relatively unguarded, particularly, as you say, Paul, for a creature of politics, which Scott Morrison most assuredly is. How did he respond? Well, there were bits that he was happy to talk about with me, happy to unpack bits of the experiences and bits of his character, I guess, for want of a better term, that he was very happy to unpack. It was interesting to me that there were other bits where he shut me down pretty lickety-split. One of the interesting things where he really didn't want to, a door he really didn't want to open was about his religious faith, which is just a very important dimension of the man. But also, interestingly to me, he didn't want to reflect on the obvious learning that he demonstrated between his experience in the bushfires in January, which we'll all remember was, shall we say, a suboptimal one. He didn't exactly rise to the occasion in the January bushfires. And I think a lot of what he learned during that period, he projected into managing the crisis, but he did not want to reflect on that. He shut that down real fast, which was kind of interesting to me because it suggests that he's still a bit traumatized by what happened during the bushfires. He doesn't really want to chew it over. He certainly doesn't want to chew it over sitting with me across a table in a political interview.
Yeah.
But I thought that was quite revealing in a way.
Yeah. Your essay is called The End of Certainty, but in many ways, Scott Morrison embodies certainty, you say. There's not a trace of doubt about him. Did you get any sense that COVID had shaken that certainty? Because, as I say, it's impossible to live in this world now and not be overwhelmed by uncertainty. And his government actually is having to navigate massive uncertainty.
Yeah, that's right. And it sort of highlights that conundrum that all governments face, and particularly governments during a crisis, is that you are required to make these incredibly momentous decisions with imperfect information. That in a nutshell is what governments do. And certainly in the opening months of the pandemic, the government had to make all kinds of dreadful, cliche, high stakes decisions with very imperfect information. And Christian Porter, the Attorney General, reflects at one point during the essay that often in those points of crisis, Australia would look to countries overseas, countries that we would normally compare ourselves against, look at those responses, benchmark ourselves against that. Were we doing something similar or were we doing something different? But because a number of the countries that we would normally benchmark ourselves against, the United States being the obvious case in point, and Britain to a lesser degree, were not reliable actors. One couldn't benchmark themselves against the performance in those countries because crazy things were happening elsewhere. So these guys were literally kind of like, oh my God, we have to do this ourselves. We have to make these decisions ourselves. In terms of what you said though about certainty, and did Morrison ever quiver, for want of a better term? Did he flail with this uncertainty? Well, look, it's hard to describe. I mean, part of the reason why I sort of assembled a narrative of what happened over the opening months of the crisis is that they were genuinely astonishing times for the government and for us as reporters. It's hard to describe how disorienting those opening weeks and months were. I do my best. Hopefully I've pulled it off, but it's very difficult to capture. And look, certainly I saw the government, I saw them I think I described Morrison at one point as grey-washed. They were exhausted, they were punch drunk, they were basically, it's sort of like they needed to sort of hit a bottom before they could come up and start to craft responses to this event. I think they were genuinely frightened. I do. I think they were genuinely frightened. And I think some of the ministers demonstrated that. But I think Scott Morrison is fundamentally this very, well, rigid is the wrong word, but I don't think he demonstrated fear or quivering in the public spotlight. I don't think we saw that, because he does have this core of certainty. Like he believes fundamentally that he wants to serve, that he has been called to serve, that he is a captain coach of a country. And I think that gave him a lot of ballast in facing up to this event. But boy, oh boy, they were knocked every which way in the opening months of this crisis.
I'm just so interested in what a crisis like this does to your political positioning. So for months, for years really, a government is arguing about the absolute imperative of a budget surplus. All of a sudden, something like this comes along and instantly it becomes clear. There is not even a debate that is needed. It becomes clear that, well, that's just a very, very minor, irrelevant point now. We need to rain billions of dollars down on the economy as quickly as we can. And Morrison did that really quickly. I mean, perhaps you could argue not quickly enough, but pretty quickly, as did Josh Frydenberg, as did the cabinet when they came to the... I mean, in a sense, does that really demonstrate that at his core, he is a political pragmatist more than anything else?
Yes. It's really the most extraordinary shapeshift that this government performed in full public view. Now, that's not to say that Morrison is not partisan. This guy is blue team to the core. And it's also not to say that there weren't ideological elements in the government's response. I think if you asked any university vice chancellor, they would say to you, hang on a minute, why were we left out?
Yeah.
So obviously there are elements of ideology that permeated the response, but in the main, in the broad, the government did quite extraordinary things, Paul. As you say, this is a government that built its entire election campaign around back in black. Then basically the first budget after the election is record debt and deficit. This government had an appetite to chase welfare debts so voracious as to lead it into potential illegality with the robo-debt scheme. Same government doubled New Start, doubled the unemployment benefit with barely a ripple of dissent or self-doubt. It's the thing is, what I think we can all learn about our Prime Minister during this crisis is this guy can and will do anything. He's not constrained. There aren't guardrails in front of him. I think a constructive way to think about this is if we think about if Tony Abbott had been the Prime Minister during this crisis, if Malcolm Turnbull had been the Prime Minister during this crisis, both of those men would have had obstructions in front of them. And by that, I mean a set of predispositions and values that would have presented or inhibited the sort of shape shift that we saw Morrison and Frydenberg pull off.
So is this because Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister, doesn't possess, in the way John Howard did, a core set of political beliefs that he's not prepared to deviate too far from? And if the answer to that question is yes, then it begs the obvious question, and I should say, this quarterly essay started off before COVID came along. The plan was that it would be a profile piece on Scott Morrison. So obviously, one of the things you were thinking of getting into is, what does he really stand for politically? What's at the core of this guy's political philosophy? We've just spoken about him being the ultimate pragmatist. What does it tell us about what he stands for, what he would die in a ditch for?
Well, this was the question I asked myself many late nights, slaving over drafts of this essay, head banging on the desk at 3 a.m. The question I kept asking myself was, what hill would this man die on in terms of his politics? John Howard, we know the hill John Howard died on. It's workplace relations and labour market deregulation. We know the hill that Malcolm Turnbull died on. It's climate change. We understand these things. We can witness this by observing their behaviour. I am yet to locate a hill that Scott Morrison would die on in terms of a set of political values. I think he is this hybrid, unusual hybrid, certainly in my reporting lifetime. I've not seen a Prime Minister who is a hybrid in the way Morrison is. He's part campaign director, which he was before he went into parliamentary service himself, and he's part Prime Minister. And so he enjoys, as Arthur Sinodinos told me before he went to Washington, every aspect of the job, except that's not quite right. He doesn't really like Parliament very much, but that's another thing. But anyway, he's a hybrid. He's unusual. I've not seen a Prime Minister like this one in terms of those predispositions. Now, pragmatism was what Australia needed during this crisis. So I think we can all be glad and grateful that this Prime Minister can do anything. That's what he's shown us he can do, right? Not all of his predecessors could have done that. But of course, then the open question about that, or the flip side of that same question is, what might he do?
Yeah. And
that is much harder to predict. So there's sort of pluses and minuses. Just quickly, Paul, because I do present him as this very protean, pragmatic, whatever it takes type of guy. That's about his professional life. That's about his public service. As a person, as a human, it comes back to faith, very important anchor for him, and a set of values that are fixed, that are very important. And obviously family, friends. He's one of these people who have maintained a friendship group over many decades. He's not very popular in politics, as all ruthless operators are. You accumulate enemies. You've got a conga line of people prepared to assassinate your character if you've been around politics as long as Scott Morrison and if you've played the game as hard as he has. But there's sort of a division is a stupid way to say it because it sounds like a split personality, but I'm presenting a guy who in his professional domain will do whatever it takes in order to fix the problem he defines. The private person, I think, is a little different.
If I can just take a step back, I've been talking to a lot of writers and thinkers about books, essays they've written during this COVID period, pieces of work that have been written against often great personal drama as well. I remember the first week in March so well. I was getting what turned out to be my last flight of the year back from Adelaide. Extraordinary thing for me to say, someone who's on a plane all of the time, probably like yourself. My last flight back from Adelaide Writers Week, I'm in the taxi going to the airport with George Megalogenis, and I'm cracking a joke about returning to the apocalypse. But I didn't really believe it, actually. And I now think that it was a joke. I don't really know what I was expecting. And then it was really only a couple of weeks later that I started to get gripped by the anxiety that we all felt. You were writing this essay and getting stuck into thinking about it in March. Can you remember when you realised that we were at the beginning of something really dire?
I remember having a conversation at the Guardian because we had the meeting one has at the start of every year about what our plans are, how we're going to somehow levitate above the news cycle and achieve all these wonderful things we want to achieve. Yeah. And that was that was very early in February that we had that. Well, no, it was actually late January we had that meeting. And there was a discussion around the table about the potential pandemic because obviously the news reports were around at that point, and Australia made very consequential decisions very shortly thereafter. But we were debating, was this a thing? Was it not a thing? Was it a beat up? Was it anyway? And we were completely unresolved in that conversation. And about 2 weeks later, we're in the biggest crisis of our reporting lifetimes. So I guess, like everybody, it's sort of crept up on me slowly. I come from a medical family. My sister has some qualifications in public health. My mum is a nurse. They were both very attentive very early on to say, oh, I think we're in some strife here. But it came slowly. And the thing is, when you, I can remember particular days where you have your personal anxiety because obviously you're in a pandemic. You don't want to be ill yourself. You don't want your loved ones to be ill or, God forbid, die. You don't want to lose your job. All of that personal anxiety is running like a backing track in your head all the time. But these amazing things are happening that require you to work 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, at least in the opening stages of the crisis. So you're sort of managing these two channels in your own mind about, I must report this soberly, fairly, accurately, but at other times, you become quite anxious. So like breaking news, journalists are human. We do get anxious. So yeah. But in terms of the when I knew, I think it was that day that Morrison and the premiers formed the National Cabinet on the hop. That was the day I think I realised we were in another place. We were, and we would be for some period of time.
Tell us about the formation of the National Cabinet. I mean, this was that grand moment where party allegiances were seemingly put aside, state and federal rivalries were shelved, and the whole nation came together, kind of reinvented federalism was kind of constructed on the run. And, we momentarily as citizens felt good about the fact that perhaps we could trust our politicians at this moment to actually do something. How did the idea of National Cabinet come about? Was this Scott Morrison's idea? Tell us a bit about that.
Well, it's such a great story. It's such a great vignette in this crisis because it was invented entirely on the hop, on the spot. What happened was there was a regular meeting of the Council of Australian Governments in Sydney, ironically in this cavernous football stadium in Parramatta, sort of early example of social distancing. Anyway, they were all there in this football stadium. And that was a really big day. Like a lot of massive things happened on that day. The stock market was in free fall. Companies were kind of announcing potential mass layoffs. Like there was everything happening on that day. The leaders went into that meeting, that COAG meeting, because in the way of COAG, agendas take a while to sort of filter up through the processes, right? So they went into that meeting thinking that they would discuss the bushfires and what they'd learned from the bushfires, and they'd get an initial kind of on-spec briefing about COVID. They didn't expect to be making major decisions that day. But parallel to the meeting of leaders, the health advisors were meeting. Brendan Murphy and the state health advisors were meeting. And there was a Barney in the meeting of the health advisors where Victoria basically said, we've got to move faster. This is serious and we've got to move faster. We've got to implement proper social distancing. We've got to start countenancing lockdowns. This threw Murphy completely off balance because this was not where the meeting was supposed to be. And it contradicted the advice that had been given to leaders. So Murphy had to shuttle out of his own meeting back into the leaders' meeting, send a note into Scott Morrison saying, sorry, Prime Minister, advice has changed. We need to do something different to what we were going to do at the end of the day. Now, people tell me Morrison was ropeable, absolutely ropeable when things changed so significantly. The Prime Minister himself narrates what happened next in the piece. Again, very honestly, he said he threw all the officials out of the room, all his staff, all the bureaucrats, everybody. It was just the group of 9 leaders. And he said what was required in that moment was a very honest political conversation about what needed to happen next and how they were going to manage this crisis. And they invented the National Cabinet in that room in half an hour. They determined that they would create this new model of federalism where the decisions would be leader-led, obviously with expert input. They would make decisions quickly. They would own the decisions together. The decision they made on that day was that they were not going to be a circular firing squad if things went to poop. That was a really profound decision they made, and they emerged with the National Cabinet. And that held really until July, and until we started to feel the weight of politics as usual returning when the second wave bubbled in Victoria, and that state was plunged into new adversity. Then we saw this fraying of this structure that they invented on the hop. But yeah, anyway, it's a great story. I would have loved to have been a fly on a wall myself when during that political conversation between the 9 of them.
Yeah, you spoke to Brendan Murphy, the then Chief Health Officer. Some people were critical of his media appearances at the time. This is a guy that's not a slick media operator. I mean, I don't think we should necessarily be appointing Chief Health Officers on the basis of how good their 30-second grabs are. But he never appeared entirely at ease. But I understand from your essay that he was very good with politicians.
Yeah. Everybody, well, I witnessed that myself because obviously we saw a great deal of Brendan Murphy, particularly in the opening months of the crisis. And by us, I mean journalists in here documenting what was happening. Unlike the rest of the country, Paul, everyone was sent home except the core team of Canberra political reporters who remained in the building with Scott Morrison, the group of 6 ministers who ran this crisis, and Brendan Murphy. So we saw a lot of each other during the opening bit of this crisis. But anyway, the point you make about Murphy is, yes, he's an expert. He didn't speak grab. I mean, I think people, particularly in the opening months of the crisis, thought he was a credible figure. People listened to what he said. But everybody who knows Brendan Murphy tells me he's really got the art of the politician. And by that, he understands how to translate complex, unfiltered, expert scientific and medical advice to a group of politicians. Because one of the reasons Australia has performed better than elsewhere, Victoria's travails notwithstanding, is that unlike elsewhere, our parliamentary people, our political class, did listen to their experts. That didn't happen everywhere. In fact, it happened in very few places. It did happen here. But the thing is, a bunch of public health experts coming together, giving politicians a bunch of unfiltered advice, that's quite a lot for them to process and deal with. And I think Murphy was really critical in the opening phase of this crisis because he could bridge those two imperatives. It's not that Murphy's a politician, he's not, but he understood how to explain things to politicians who would be making decisions. And everybody I spoke to who knows Murphy well says, yeah, he really has that art, that knack of being able to intervene at the right moment, lay information before a politician that maximises the chances of what comes out the other side not being a cocker.
He must have found himself at a moment where he was terribly worried because some of the early modelling about what could have happened in Australia was utterly frightening. Numbers around the 10,000 deaths by May kind of situation. Yeah. Did he communicate that to you, that there was a sense at a certain point where he was really sort of pinned back in his seat about what the prospects might be that were ahead?
I think they were very nervous at the beginning, but the main thing was not so much those epidemiology. Oh goodness me, I can't even say the word epidemiological model.
That's it.
Thank you. I got there in the end. Thank you, everyone. Not so much that, although obviously there were some pretty bracing numbers, as you say, and particularly that Oxford study that came out early that basically set the entire world back on its haunches. So there was that. I think Murphy's main problem at the start was they didn't get information out of China that they trusted. There was conflicting information, particularly at the beginning, about whether or not this was a virus that could be transferred between humans. Obviously, you've got to stand up and kind of project to the public, because Murphy was projected into that role of being a narrator of a crisis in a way. You've got to stand up, you've got to look confident, you've got to tell people, you've got to reassure people, but not too much, because if you reassure them too much, they won't act and change their behaviour, which is actually very important. And at the same time, where the information they got at the beginning was conflicting. There was human to human transmission. There wasn't. It was serious. No, it wasn't that serious. And it took several weeks for that to iron out. Interestingly, I'll just say this quickly. I'm reading Bob Woodward's excellent book, Rage, at the moment. And it looks like the Americans were better informed at the end of January and February as to the worst case scenario involving this virus. I don't think we had in Australia as clear intelligence as the Americans did about what this virus was doing. I think the gap's only really a couple of weeks between what Trump's saying he knew in late January versus what Australian officials knew in late January. But there is a little air gap there, which is quite interesting. We didn't know as much as the Americans knew about the risks associated with this pandemic early on.
Yes, and Brendan Murphy has something to say rather pointedly about the difference between Australia's approach in terms of listening to the experts compared to the UK and the US, doesn't he?
He does, yes. We did have a bit of a laugh. I asked him for the essay whether or not he'd ever met Anthony Fauci, who a lot of people listening on to this conversation will know is
the long-suffering Anthony Fauci. Yeah.
The long-suffering and brilliantly poker-faced Anthony Fauci. Yes, I asked him, Murphy, did he know him? He said, no, not really. They'd had a couple of glancing, superficial encounters. But Murphy was so profoundly grateful to be in a different set of circumstances. He never at any point ran the risk of being contradicted by the politicians who he was giving health advice to. And Murphy, I think, understood, pathetically grateful is the way to describe that. I think he genuinely was pathetically grateful that we could have a fact-based conversation still in Australia, and that he didn't have to navigate a crisis as well as navigating the communication of a crisis in a post-truth world.
Yeah.
And that's the risk. Sort of at the governance level, what motivates me as a reporter, and part of the reason that I wanted to write this piece, is that I'm terribly worried about that. I'm terribly worried about the acceleration of societies and cultures into post-truth states and the consequences of that. And I have worried over the past decade that Australia stands on the brink of that. Yeah. And I think the reassuring bit about the opening phase of the crisis is that we stood on that precipice and we chose not to jump. We chose to remain in a fact, reason and truth-based set of propositions. And look, as a citizen, let alone as a reporter, I just found that tremendously reassuring.
Well, we saw for a moment there, perhaps we're still seeing it, the revival of trust in institutions and in government. I mean, it had been a very crude decade and a half of politics in Australia leading up to this, prime ministers and opposition leaders and governments being torn asunder, and trust in governments and institutions was at a very low ebb. But you've had a look at some of the numbers that have resulted from how we have been governed during at least the earlier phase of this pandemic, and trust has gone up.
It has, yeah. And this was one of the fascinating kind of subplots of the crisis that I wanted to document in the essay. We at The Guardian have a collaboration with the Essential poll. And during the crisis, Peter Lewis, the head of Essential, thought it was important to really try and get a data set about sentiment throughout the crisis. So we were polling every week during the crisis over several months. And that enabled us to track this sort of renaissance, is a bit sort of a pretentious construction to put on it, a bit ridiculous really, but we did see this return of trust into both with institutions certainly with the political class, and even briefly with the media, although it was sort of rather more gritted teeth. But it was really interesting because, as you say, the previous decade we'd gone entirely in the other direction. The pandemic has pulled us back into this careful, cautious, trust relationship with institutions. This is why I think it's so important that the political class, the state leaders and Scott Morrison, don't act like a pack of idiots during this crisis, because they have coaxed society, our community, back to a constructive relationship with one of the most important institutions in our society, which is our democratic system and our processes. If they act like a mob of idiots during this crisis, there will be a significant price to pay as a consequence of that. And I don't just mean in economic wreckage and in lives lost. I mean that people have dared to trust their political systems again to a degree. And if politicians give them a reason to not trust them, to not trust that democracy serves their interests, then I think people rightly will be very repelled by this whole system. So again, I hate the cliche about high stakes, but I think genuinely we are in a very high stakes environment.
I find this interesting as well. I mean, it seems to me as if it's in the interests of governments on many levels not to revert back to that. I mean, we're seeing at the moment, for example, the benefits of incumbency that come with the increase in trust. Very hard moment right now for oppositions to get any political oxygen, because people are still to some extent invested. But of course, not just that. It's not just the political incentive. There's the incentive that these are unbelievably important matters at hand. Yep. The health and lives of Australians, but also the economic livelihood as well. And that, if we see cynicism and toxicity reintroduced back into the political environment, it makes their jobs less certain, but it also stuffs the rest up as well, potentially.
No, exactly. And I think that's very important to draw out. And I think people understand that. I genuinely think that people around Australia understand how important these times are and how important it is that our representatives do not fail us in our hour of need. And this is the sort of, I don't think the entire response has been stuffed up, but I don't think the relationships are irrevocably broken between state leaders and Scott Morrison. But I think we have seen some really unfortunate behaviour over the last month or so.
Today in particular too, actually, between Dan Andrews and Greg Hunt and Josh Frydenberg. Exactly. The language was very inflamed, wasn't it, today?
Exactly, and you feel like screaming at them, which obviously would be deeply professionally inappropriate. Be better.
Yeah.
Be better. We need you to be better.
Katharine, did you ever think that you would see the day when a Liberal government led by Scott Morrison would call in Sally McManus and Greg Combay to help them construct, to A, double the New Start allowance, and B, construct the JobKeeper payment that would pay people generous amounts of money to not work?
Yeah, well, it was certainly interesting times. And again, just at the risk of boring people, this is why I wanted to document this history, because truly amazing things were happening in terms of rapprochements across society and across civil society and government, across relationships. People had to make really rapid fire assessments about whether or not they could trust people who were previously their adversaries. They had to make visceral, instinctive human judgments. Can I trust this person? Can I enter into a good faith process with this person? And blow me down, all around the place, that was happening. Greg Combay was a really important early advisor to the government on a range of issues, former Labor minister. Sally McManus and Christian Porter developed a genuinely trusting, cordial, personal relationship, despite their quite distinctly different views of the world. They sat around a table, at least on those IR groups, for months, trying to broker a solution. Now, I think their differences are very fundamentally difficult to reconcile, and we've reached that point now, sadly, where those discussion groups about IR policy in the future have broken down. But the fact that they lasted for 6 months of dogged, consistent work speaks to the fact that people made judgments about one another, who you can trust and who you can try and come to terms with. And I think it's at least from the union officials' point of view, and Combay was certainly a union official before he was a parliamentarian, and Sally McManus obviously runs the ACTU. A lot of union work at that high level is in crisis mode during big disputes. The work that you don't see in the kind of cliched Labor versus capital debates is business leaders and union officials sitting around trying to nut out a solution, which is what happens during these really big crises. And I think union officials, because of their job, learn who you can trust and who you can't in those sort of situations. But it was a credit to Porter and to Morrison and others for genuinely bringing in people with whom they were normally at odds with and trying to negotiate a solution. Now, of course, there was a political benefit for the government in doing that. I'm not saying it's all altruism. Let's all braid each other's hair and have a rom-com movie night. It wasn't like that, because obviously Morrison, all political leaders benefited from this sense of turning down the tribalism, not screeching at one another all the time, being seen to act in the national interest collaboratively benefited all of them. And they were acutely aware of that. But I do think genuinely some really interesting relationships happened in the opening months of the crisis. And anyway, I try and document them in the piece.
Well, COVID throws up many revelations. One of them is that Australia's Attorney General, Christian Porter, is obsessed with post-apocalyptic science fiction and has been since well before COVID arrived. It's like he's been preparing for the apocalypse for his whole life.
All his life.
Perfectly placed.
All his life. The Attorney General knew the apocalypse was only just around the corner, and at some point he would be drummed into service. So yes, there's some really nice personal reflections that Porter shares in his interview for the piece. One is this obsession that he has with post-apocalyptic sci-fi and the tropes of sci-fi. He recounts a conversation he had with his family when the first reports came out of Wuhan about this virus. And in the Porter family, I think they're all a bit into this post-apocalyptic sci-fi. They all know that the tropes and they share the tropes. And that the family said to one another during the Christmas break of the pandemic, this is the way the apocalypse starts. and sure enough, there we were, drummed into the apocalypse. So
yeah, it's interesting, actually. I have to say that of all of the people that you interview and write about in the essay, Christian Porter is the one person who I felt I genuinely found out a lot more about as a result of some of the answers he gave to questions. I mean, I think you asked him a question at one point about, how much do you think will change forever as a question? And his response was I think, most unpolitician-like. He just came out and said, so many things have changed irreversibly as a result of this. And I just thought, it's not the kind of thing that politicians usually say. And in his area, an area of interest and area of ministerial responsibility, work and workplace relations, I mean, it opens up possibilities if we can somehow get Sally McManus or people like her and him and representatives into a room together, notwithstanding all of those divisions and disagreements, to think about and talk about the new way of work.
Yeah, that's right. And you're right. He was very candid in his reflections, which I was very grateful to him for. Christian Porter, if you've not come across him, is a sort of child of a political family and a lawyer and a former prosecutor. He's a very meticulous person. He's sort of he's one of those people who has sort of neat and tidy, tiny writing that he prepares meticulously for everything that he does. And when I went in to see him on the day we did the interview, I saw these meticulously prepared notes, which is very, very Christian Porter in terms of the way he manifests. And I just said to him at the opening of the conversation, Christian, tell me the story of this pandemic. Tell me the story of it. And he told me the story, which I was very grateful to him for. But yeah, in terms of just that basic point about everything's changed, he's the father of a couple of young kids. He's separated. He shares care of his children with his former wife. He was reflecting about how the world for us and for them would be entirely different. That the whole, would we have CBDs with workers clustered there anymore in the future? What would become of sort of the whole? You talked about travel, Paul. That you were on the last flight of the year. What becomes of travel? What becomes of travel? How do we organise work? What do we do if employees are as productive or almost as productive working at home? What are they doing sequestered away in offices? Exposing themselves to the risk of infection or being super spreaders. He saw this as an event, as a pivot point in history that would put us in a different place. And I suspect he's right.
You spoke to Josh Frydenberg as well. We've spoken a lot about how governments listened to the expert advice of scientists and medical specialists during the pandemic and the benefits that we derived from that. But governments must also have sought advice on the devastating economic impact of this pandemic as well. Whose advice was Josh Frydenberg listening to and trusting when he and his fellow ministers set about formulating the stimulus package and the JobKeeper package and so on?
Well, the government at the beginning was running behind events because it was sort of impossible to do anything other than run behind events. Again, it's hard to sort of impart the velocity at which things were moving in the beginning. So they were running behind events. Now, just before I get to the who, did he rely on, just very quickly, again, a nice little insight vignette in the piece is that Frydenberg went to a meeting of the IMF in Saudi Arabia quite early in the year and obviously was aware of COVID and the risks, but everyone was more sanguine at that point. He happened to find himself seated next to the Italian finance minister at this gathering. And the Italian finance minister kept having to get up and go away from the table and take calls to deal with the crisis at home because at that stage, COVID was tearing through Italy. And Frydenberg said, really, it was that point where my Italian colleague spent half of that dinner on the phone at home trying to navigate this terrible crisis that it sort of dawned on me, okay, this is going to be worse than I think. In terms of the who of the advice, I think Australia has been very fortunate to have at the helm of Treasury a guy called Stephen Kennedy. Now, Stephen Kennedy is the Secretary of the Department. By an amazing happenstance, Stephen Kennedy, before he was a Treasury econocrat, was a nurse. He had a sort of midlife career change where he gave up the nursing and went and did a PhD in economics at the Australian National University and moved into a career as an economics bureaucrat. He, as well as his medical training, Stephen also did a research paper when he was a more junior Treasury official about the economic impacts of pandemics after the SARS and MERS event. He was fascinated because those events came and went more quickly, washed through the system more quickly. But Stephen Kennedy really wanted to try and set himself down in a pandemic where things would not wash through the system so quickly. So what would be the economic impacts of it? So in a way, just by luck, and it is luck, Australia had an economic official at the top of Treasury who was highly sensitised to the health dimensions of the crisis, unusually, and also had some acquired expertise, both in public health and in what pandemics do. So he and his deputy, deputies, I should say, at Treasury, who have different skills in forecasting and in policy development, were very forward-leaning with the government. And I think his advice, certainly in the opening phase of the pandemic, was sought after by the government and trusted by the government, even though Kennedy had spent a period working for the Labor Party. He, in fact, another little bit of happenstance, Stephen Kennedy was actually one of the advisors to Kevin Rudd in his private political office during the global financial crisis.
Oh, wow.
But despite the fact that he had had a stint working for the other side, as it were, I think Frydenberg relied on Kennedy's advice very heavily, and I think his advice was sought after and respected within the government as well.
There are many people who say that the toughest period is still ahead of us, and you ask, do we have the collective fortitude to live in uncertainty without turning on each other? What's your guess?
Well, it depends. It depends how optimistic or pessimistic I'm feeling on it.
I suppose the question really is, we're seeing, as we've spoken of, we're seeing some fracturing of that consensus. We're seeing some sniping resuming. Are we deep though back into the trenches yet, or is there still hope that some residual kind of bipartisanship, if I could use that not quite perfect word?
Yeah, well, I think we're not down the sinkhole in terms of politics. I see some troubling trends, and I said a minute ago, everyone needs to be better than this, and I genuinely believe they can be and must be for our sake. But I think also one of the things that we need to touch down on in answering your question, Paul, is I think what a lot of people have discovered outside the sort of crucible of politics during this crisis is they have rediscovered the importance of community and of social capital and of living with other human beings, even at a distance, and perhaps being forced to distance from other humans and adjusting our behaviours, our natural instinctive behaviours, like throwing your arms around people you love or even people you don't, or having to, sort of police your own behaviour so that you're not a risk to others. I think all of that has reinforced with people, with humans who are the building blocks of this story and the most important asset of any nation are the humans. I think we have discovered that being in a community matters, that it is what needs to be invested in more than anything else. So in tracking back to your question, which is, am I hopeful? I am in that respect, that I think we have rediscovered things that we had perhaps forgotten in our very frenetic, busy, productivity-focused lives. We'd forgotten how important it is to be in a suburb, in a neighbourhood, with a bunch of other people, within a community of humans. I think we've relearned those lessons. And that's important, and it's a psychological bedrock for the country. That said, I think the longer this goes on without any obvious end point, the more difficult it is, just from a point of human psychology, for people to maintain themselves in sort of amity with others. It's sort of, I think people have faced enormous pressure this year around the world and in Australia. I think people have faced extraordinary pressure and anxiety. And the longer that goes on, the more fraying that is. So I just hope the sort of pluses of what I just said, that re-engagement with community can fortify us if the future is, tracking back to the title of the project, if the future is uncertainty, if that is the future, if things can't be known, if we can't get a vaccine that's effective, that's rolled out quickly, if we're living with this uncertainty for a period of time, I hope we can be our best selves.
Yeah, I mean, I find it incredible how the citizens of Melbourne have responded to the lockdown. I mean, we in the media, we're always looking for stories of conflict and negative stories and stories of how people have breached some part of the lockdown. But the real story in Victoria is not that story at all. The real story there is a story of incredible compliance for the good of everybody in that state. And it's quite remarkable. Sure, some disagreement, but I've been incredibly amazed by it, actually.
I'd go further, Paul. I'd say I'm moved by it.
Yeah,
by the stoicism of people in Victoria over these last months. Because remember, I'm sure all of us have great mates in Melbourne and family members will know that these guys have effectively been in some stage of lockdown for the best part of 6 months. They haven't killed each other. It's amazing. They've got on with it. Sure, there's been a noisy political debate, but the story again of the humans, of the building blocks of this story, the humans of Australia, they have largely complied with public health restrictions, and the results are in. The curve has been flattened again, and that is amazing. And I can't wait to see and hug my Melbourne friends again. That'll be nice.
Yeah, indeed.
But it's amazing what they've done. And rather than some of the sort of vituperative, yucky stuff, we need to build our friends in Melbourne and Victoria up, because what they've done is amazing.
Okay, just a final question, and we'll end on politics, because there are big political issues that are going to need to be dealt with in the months and the years ahead. And there are, we've spoken around sitting around the circle and holding hands and all being friendly, but at the end of the day, there's some real sharp points of difference that are going to potentially emerge. We've seen one of them come through Parliament just recently, the tertiary education reforms, the new fees, and some passionate speeches in Parliament about that. But there will be big debates ahead around industrial relations and the future of work and so on. And, when this happens, that's when our kind of two-party system comes into play, and three-party system if you speak about the minor parties. I mean, at the moment, it's been very hard, really, for Anthony Albanese to get any kind of word in. What do you see? How do you see them being able to re-engage over the next period before the next election? Are they going to be able to bring themselves into the game and start to engage in the kind of debates that we'll probably now have between now and then?
Yeah, I think we're seeing some of the foundations of that being laid around the budget period. There's a genuine contest of ideas going forward. I think I've been pretty negative about sort of punch and judy politics in this conversation, but I think the battle of ideas is really important and part of the deliberation, the really fundamentally important deliberation in a democracy. So between now and the election, I think we are going to see a debate about two approaches to a crisis, and two approaches more pertinently to a recovery after a crisis. One where a government is more present, one where a government is more absent. I mean, that's a very, very helicopter sketch, but you get the basic dynamic. And I think that's important, because there are, the government needs to be accountable. All of these ideas are contestable. I think for the sake of the country, we do need to have this debate. Are we doing it right, for want of a better term? Are we on the right path? Are we sort of nourishing the things that got us through the crisis, right? So I think we'll see that. I do think it is difficult, though. We've seen a couple of election results over this past weekend. We've seen Jacinda Ardern returned in New Zealand. In my hometown of Canberra, where I'm speaking to you tonight from, we've seen the ACT Labor government returned. In Queensland, of course, you guys are heading into an election, real lickety-spit. We'll see what the result is there. I think those two contests we've just seen, New Zealand and ACT, demonstrate the difficulty that you're getting to, Paul, which is being heard if you're an opposition.
Yeah.
If you are a government that's competently managing a crisis and being seen to, then I think the crisis environment does benefit incumbents. It is very difficult for oppositions to find their way into the conversation around the crisis. So, look, we're certainly going to see a battle of ideas, I think, between now and the next federal election. Will people be focused on it? Will they engage with it? Will they listen? I don't know yet. And I think that's partly a function of whether the crisis conditions persist as they currently are, or whether people get a bit of a circuit breaker next year if a vaccine turns up, if there's a sort of a sense that we're tracking more to more normal conditions. So I think it's a bit of a watch this space, that one.
Yeah, let's hope the latter proves to be the case. Katharine, fantastic to talk to you. Thank you very much for your time. Your essay is excellent. Let me say that to the Zoom audience, well worth a read. We didn't cover plenty of what's in it, so grab a copy. And thanks for your time on Big Ideas and with us in the Avid Reader Zoom room. Thanks, Katharine.
Thank you for such a generous conversation. I appreciate it.
Cheers. Back to you, Chrissy.
Thanks very much for both of you. We have gone a little bit over, but there's one question from the audience that I'll just pose to you before we click off from the audience. And I'm not quite sure I'm reading this right, but the question from CG is, why did they stop listening to advice in budget process? And when did they decide to be a catalyst and not a leader? Now, I'm assuming they is the government in this case. So do you think the government has stopped listening to advice in budget process? And are they a catalyst and not a leader at this point?
It's interesting that the latter part of that question is very interesting. In terms of the listening to advice, no, I don't think they stopped listening to advice. What we saw in the budget by way of a recovery is a very on-brand, centre-right set of propositions for an economic recovery out of a recession. So I don't think that sort of equates to failing to listen to advice. I think they followed advice, but obviously they picked what of the advice they wanted to follow, if that makes sense, right? I think the budget is strikingly on brand for the Liberal and National parties. In terms of catalyst versus leader, yeah, it's interesting because it's sort of it's a very interesting question. No, I think there has been leadership, I do, during this crisis, and I think leadership continues to happen, but perhaps I'm not sure if I'm doing the question justice, but perhaps the catalyst might lean in a bit to this idea of Scott Morrison being this black outline in the colouring book, that he's leaving room, as he always does, I think, for voters, for people in the community to project their own questions and needs onto him as a Prime Minister. So I think it's a little of both would be my observation, catalyst and leader.
Fantastic. Look, that was the only question. We did have a thank you for the fascinating conversation from Christine Jackman, who had to run. But it has been fascinating. I echo Christine's message there. It's been really interesting. This is the first real kind of physical book that we've had since the beginning of the pandemic that has kind of linked a lot of the ideas that have been flying around in people's conversations, in people's lounge rooms. And it's really good to have something that nails it down and gives us something a little bit more meaty to talk about. And congratulations on getting this done on the fly so quickly. I know how hard it is to write a quarterly essay. I've heard it from every single person that we've had interviewed about their quarterly essay, that this is one of the hardest things to do. And yours was done in a timely manner during a pandemic. Congratulations, my hat goes off to you. Thank you very much for bringing us this quarterly essay.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks, Paul, for doing such a great interview again. It's been wonderful. I have put the link to the book there and also a code, EVENT, which you can use at the checkout to get 10% off the quarterly and also anything else you put in your cart using that code. So everyone, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again at our Avid Reader Night soon. See you later.